The glass clinked at the far end of the table. My Aunt Carol stood with a smile too wide to be natural. Everyone lifted their cups, turning to listen, expecting warmth. I straightened in my chair, hoping this year would be different. It wasn't. "Let's raise a toast," she said, her eyes sliding toward me with something cold in them. "To Sonia, living proof that not everyone in this family turns out successful." The laughter hit me like a slap. My cousin Brett leaned in beside me. "Didn't you lose everything last year?" I stayed completely still. The heat crawled up my neck. I looked around the table at every face I had known since I was a child. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family, friends. And not one person said a word to defend me. Not one. My name is Sonia Hargrove. I was 34 years old, sitting in the same house where I had grown up celebrating every Christmas and Thanksgiving I could remember. And in that one awful moment, I finally understood what was happening. This was never a reunion. It was a setup. And every single person in that room had known it except me. The label disappointment had followed me since I was a little girl. I never chose it. It was placed on me quietly, without anyone asking my opinion. Every mistake I made growing up was treated like big news. Every achievement I had was brushed aside. Meanwhile, my cousins Brett and Amber were treated like royalty. Brett got a car for his 18th birthday. Amber got a fully paid trip to Europe after college. I got a birthday card with a $20 bill tucked inside. I told myself for years that this was just how some families worked. Some people got more, some got less. I convinced myself it was not personal. But the part that hurt most, more than Brett's constant jokes or Aunt Carol's sharp smile, was my mother. Her name was Diane. She had known me my entire life, and she knew exactly what kind of family she had raised me in. That evening, she sat at the far end of the table with her hands folded in her lap. She had heard every word of that toast. She had watched every face that laughed. She said nothing. Not one single word. "Didn't your little company collapse?" Someone called from across the table. It was Uncle Ray, my aunt's husband, the kind of man who spoke loudly when he thought it would land well with the crowd. A few people chuckled around him. I looked up slowly from my plate. I nodded just slightly and let the assumption sit there between us. What they believed was that my business had fallen apart, that I had tried, failed, and quietly disappeared with nothing to show for it. That was the version circulating through the family. I had heard it secondhand for months. Sonia's company went under. Sonia lost everything. Poor Sonia. None of it was true. I had not lost my business. I had made a very deliberate, very calculated decision to walk away from it on my own terms. I had reasons. I had a plan. I had kept both entirely to myself. But sitting at that table, surrounded by people who were comfortable in their assumptions, I had no interest in correcting anyone. Not yet. Let them feel right. Let them get comfortable. I smiled faintly at my plate and said nothing at all. About an hour into dinner, I needed air. I quietly excused myself and slipped down the hallway toward the bathroom. The noise from the dining room faded behind me to a low hum. That was when I heard it. Aunt Carol was near the kitchen doorway, her back turned, speaking in the hushed tone she used when she thought no one important was listening. I stopped just out of sight. One hand pressed flat against the wall. "Good thing she didn't fight the inheritance," Aunt Carol said. "Made everything so much easier for us." A woman's voice I didn't fully recognize laughed quietly in response. I didn't move. My breathing went shallow. I pressed myself closer to the wall and kept my shoes perfectly still on the hardwood floor. Inheritance. That single word dropped into my chest like a stone into still water. What inheritance? Nobody had ever mentioned an inheritance to me. Not my mother. Not my aunt. Nobody. As far as I had always been told, there was nothing to receive and nothing to fight over. I had clearly been told the wrong thing for a very long time. The memories came in pieces after that, rising up like things I had tried to bury but never quite managed to. Birthdays first. I was 12 when I noticed the pattern clearly for the first time. Brett and Amber opened present after present while I received a book and a quiet smile across the table. I told myself books were thoughtful. I was 12 years old and wanted a bicycle like every other kid on my street. Then came college. I was 17, sitting across from my mother at our kitchen table, asking about the college fund my grandmother had supposedly set up years before. My mother pressed her lips together and said the money simply was not available. I believed her completely. I had no reason not to. But there were other signs too. Conversations that stopped when I walked into a room. Looks exchanged between adults over certain topics. Christmas gifts that were always slightly less, always slightly smaller. Always carrying the quiet message that I mattered just a bit less than everyone else. This was never an accident. Someone in that family had been making careful, deliberate choices about me for a very long time. And nobody at any of those birthday tables had ever said a single word about it. Brett found me near the window after I came back from the hallway. He wore the same easy smile he always had. The kind that looked like confidence but always felt like cruelty underneath it. "You always had potential, Sonia," he said, swirling his drink. "Just never any follow-through." People nearby heard him. A few smiled. A cousin at the next table glanced up from her phone. I looked at him calmly. "You'd be surprised what I follow through on." He laughed. It was the dismissive kind. The laugh of a man who has already decided he has won the conversation without waiting to see how it ends. I held my smile and let him have that moment. Brett had grown up being told he was the sharp one, the one with real business sense. He ran a small construction company that had been struggling financially for the past 2 years. I knew this because I had spent time carefully researching every person who would be sitting at that table before I ever walked through the front door. He had absolutely no idea what I knew. He really truly should not have laughed. Uncle Ray brought up my father near the end of the first course. He leaned back in his chair with the ease of someone saying something he had rehearsed many times before. "Shame about your dad," he said, nodding at me. "Walking out like that. Never looking back." A few heads nodded around the table. My mother, at the far end, gave a small quiet nod, as though it were simply a known fact, like the date on a calendar. I kept my face completely steady. My father's name was Tom Hargrove. The family story had always been simple. He walked away from us when I was 9 years old and never made contact again. I had been raised on that version. I believed it for a very long time. But 3 years ago, I found something that changed everything I thought I knew about him. He did not walk away. He was pushed out. I didn't have every detail yet. But I had enough. And my mother's calm little nod at the far end of that table confirmed what I had suspected for years. She had always known the truth. And she had chosen over and over again to say absolutely nothing. I found the envelope when I was 19. My mother had asked me to dig through the storage closet at the back of the house for some tax documents she needed. I was reaching for a folder on the middle shelf when a white envelope slipped from behind a stack of old magazines and fell to the floor. I almost put it back without looking. Instead, I opened it. Inside were 3 old bank statements. Each one showed a transfer made from an account in Tom Hargrove's name. Regular deposits once a month every single month going back years. The amounts were not small. The statements covered a period starting just after I turned 9, running all the way to the month I turned 16. My father had been sending money every single month for 7 years. I never received $1 of it. My mother never mentioned it. Not once. She had told me he left and never looked back, and I had believed that story my entire life. But those 3 bank statements told a completely different story. I replaced them carefully and brought my mother her tax documents without saying a word. I acted like nothing had happened, but I never ever forgot what I had seen. The invitation arrived 6 weeks before the reunion. A plain white envelope with my name handwritten on the front. No note inside, just a date, a time and an address printed neatly on a small cream card. I stared at it for a long time. It had been 3 years since I had attended any family event. 3 full years of careful, deliberate distance. 3 years of building something real and entirely my own. Far away from the noise of people who had spent most of my life measuring me against a standard they never intended me to reach. They had stayed completely silent for 3 years. And now suddenly they were inviting me back. Standing in my kitchen that evening, turning the card over in my hands, I understood exactly why. They assumed I had failed again, quietly and completely. They pictured me worn down, broke, and easy to dismiss. I was none of those things. And I had decided to let them find that out for themselves in their own time, in the room where they had always felt most comfortable looking down at me. I replied to the invitation with a single word. "Yes. Sonia, why don't you say something?" Aunt Carol's voice rose above the table chatter halfway through the main course. She said it with a smile, the kind that pretended to be generous but was really a trap. Heads turned. Eyes landed on me. I knew exactly what she wanted. They wanted a breakdown. A stammered defense or tearful explanation about where my life had gone wrong. They wanted an apology, proof that I was still the failure they had always said I was. Maybe some of them wanted real tears, the kind that would be talked about at every reunion for years to come. I understood all of it in the 1 second the room went quiet. I set my fork down slowly. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. Then I pushed back my chair and stood up. Completely calm, completely steady, like someone who had practiced this moment many times in her own mind. Because I had. Every single word of what was about to happen had been ready and waiting inside me for a very long time. And now it was finally time to use it. I think it's interesting, I said, keeping my voice low and even, how confident everyone here seems about things they don't actually understand. The room changed. Not all at once, but I felt the shift move through it like a small drop in temperature. The easy laughter stopped. The smirks faded. People who had been comfortable just moments ago were now sitting slightly straighter in their chairs. Aunt Carol tilted her head. What is that supposed to mean? I didn't answer her directly. Instead, I looked slowly around the table, meeting eyes where I could. Brett had set his drink down. My mother's hands were completely still in her lap. I've been sitting here all evening, I continued, listening to a version of my life that I barely recognize. A version everyone in this room has accepted, because nobody ever bothered to check whether it was actually true. I paused and let the words find their places. So before anyone laughs again, I think it's only fair to share a few facts. Nobody laughed. Nobody even tried. That told me everything I needed to know about how the rest of the evening was going to go. You're right about one thing, I said. My company isn't mine anymore. The smirks came back quickly. Brett settled into his chair with a look of satisfaction. A cousin at the far end leaned over to whisper to the person beside her. Aunt Carol raised her eyebrows slightly, looking pleased with herself. I let that moment breathe. Then I said it. I sold it. Brett's satisfaction flickered. Aunt Carol's eyebrows stayed raised, but for an entirely different reason now. The whispering cousin went quiet. I sold it, I repeated, because I received an offer that made no sense to turn down. My company did not collapse. It did not fail. I made a business decision, a very good one, and I walked away on my own terms at a time entirely of my choosing. The room was very still. I had spent 2 years building that company from a single laptop in a spare bedroom. I had grown it carefully and quietly. When the right offer came, I took it without hesitation. Would you like to know what I sold it for? Nobody answered. But nobody looked away either. I said the number. I didn't whisper it or soften it. I stated it clearly, the way you would state a simple fact like a date or a distance between two cities. Someone at the far end of the table set their fork down. The small sound it made against the plate was the only thing anyone heard for a long moment. Brett let out a short laugh. That's not funny, Sonia. I'm not joking, I said. He looked at me the way people look at something they very much want to disbelieve. Head slightly forward, eyes narrowed, searching hard for the trick. He found nothing. My cousin Amber, sitting directly across from me, had gone completely quiet. She was the same person who had pulled me aside before dinner to whisper that she felt sorry for me. That was before the toast. Before Brett's comments. Before the whole table laughed together. She was not saying a single word now. I had built that business from absolutely nothing. I had sold it for more than most people at that table would ever see in their lifetimes. And I had kept every detail entirely to myself until this exact moment. And about that inheritance, I added. The temperature in the room dropped. I watched it happen. Aunt Carol's shoulders pulled slightly inward, her jaw tightened. Uncle Ray set his glass down carefully on the table. I had everyone's complete attention now. I never fought it, I said. I think some people in this room found a great deal of comfort in that fact. They assumed I didn't know it existed. Or they believed I was too consumed with my own problems to notice. I paused and looked directly at Aunt Carol. I didn't fight it because I didn't need it. I had already started building what I needed entirely on my own. But let me be very clear. She opened her mouth slightly. I know exactly what was in that inheritance, I said. I know what my grandmother set aside for me specifically. And I know that the money did not go where she intended it to go. I reached down and lifted the folder I had placed beside my chair before dinner started. I set it on the table in front of me. And I have proof. I opened the folder and slid the first document to the center of the table. It was a copy. I kept the original somewhere very safe. The page showed a transfer. A specific amount. A specific date. A name. The name was not mine. My mother's face changed in a way I had never seen before. The color left her cheeks slowly, like water draining from a glass. She stared at the document for a long moment and then looked away, as though the page itself had hurt her to see. Aunt Carol pressed her lips together tightly. She did not reach for the document. These are records from my grandmother's estate, I said evenly. I requested them 2 years ago through the estate attorney's office. He was not aware I had never been informed of my inheritance. He had assumed I simply chose not to claim it. I slid a second page forward. This shows exactly where the money went. It shows the signatures that authorized the transfer. And it shows that the authorization happened just 14 days after my grandmother passed away. The room was completely silent. I turned to look at my mother directly. She sat at the far end of the table, both hands wrapped around her water glass. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, somehow older too. The woman who raised me, who told me my father left without looking back, who had watched the whole evening happen without saying one word in my defense. She looked like someone who had just realized the walls around her were made of paper. You knew, I said quietly. She opened her mouth. Then she closed it. I kept my voice low and steady. The silence was doing all the necessary work. You knew about my grandmother's inheritance. You knew what was meant for me. And you never said a word. Not when I was struggling. Not when I lost my first apartment because I couldn't make rent. Not one single time. Her eyes moved quickly to Aunt Carol, then back down to the table in front of her. That single glance told me everything. They had made this decision together. Planned it together. And my mother had allowed it to happen to her own daughter without ever saying a word about it. Brett pushed back first. He always had to be the one to push back. You're making this up, he said, his voice tight. You found some old paperwork and built a whole story around it. That's exactly what you do, Sonia. You always made yourself into the victim. I looked at him quietly for a moment. Then I reached into the folder and slid another page across the table toward him. This one had a section highlighted near the bottom. A signature line with his mother's name written clearly on it. Aunt Carol's own signature. Am I said. Brett picked up the page. His eyes moved across it quickly at first, then slowly. His jaw tightened. He set it down carefully on the table, as though it were something he did not want to be holding. He said absolutely nothing after that. I had spent 2 years collecting these documents. I had paid a private attorney out of my own savings to help me trace every transfer, every signature, every authorization. I had been patient and thorough and completely quiet about all of it. I had been waiting for exactly this moment. Something shifted in the room after that. It happened slowly, like a tide quietly going out. The people who had laughed loudest at Aunt Carol's toast were now very interested in their dinner plates. The cousin who had been whispering earlier was staring hard at the tablecloth. Uncle Ray had not said a word in several minutes, and his silence said more than anything he could have offered. Brett sat with his arms folded across his chest, but there was no real confidence behind it anymore. He looked like someone trying to appear calm, while something was quietly collapsing underneath him. Aunt Carol still hadn't touched the documents on the table. She was holding herself very carefully, the kind of stillness people use when they are afraid that any small movement might give too much away. And my mother still hadn't looked up from the table in front of her. The story that everyone in that room had agreed on for years, the one where I was the failure, the burden, the family disappointment, was falling apart one page at a time. I was no longer the joke at that table. Every single person there knew it. There's one more thing, I said. I let the words sit for a moment before I continued. I found my father. The reaction came fast. Someone made a sharp sound near the middle of the table. A woman pressed her hand over her mouth. Aunt Carol's chin lifted slightly, The careful kind of movement that meant she was working hard to hold her expression together. 3 years ago, I said, I started looking for him. Took a long time. Cost money I didn't easily have. But I found him. I paused. He never stopped trying to reach me. After he left, after he was told to leave, he wrote letters. He sent money every single month until I turned 16. He contacted this family multiple times over the years, and was told each time that I had moved on and wanted nothing to do with him. I looked directly at my mother. That was never my decision. I never saw one letter. I never received $1 of that money. And I never once told anyone I didn't want to know my own father. Nobody in that room said a word. The table had gone completely still. I stood straight and let everything I had said settle into the room around me. The documents were spread on the table. The facts had been spoken out loud, in front of everyone who had spent years believing a version of me that was never real. You didn't ruin me, I said. My voice was steady. Not cold, not angry, just clear. You tried. Some of you believed you had succeeded. You kept back my inheritance. You hid my father from me. You spent my entire childhood making sure I felt like less than everyone else. And when I disappeared for 3 years, you assumed I had finally broken. I looked slowly around the table, at Brett, at Aunt Carol, at Uncle Ray, at my mother, at every face that had laughed just an hour before. But I didn't break. I built. I worked and saved and found the truth on my own, without one single person at this table helping me. I paused and let that land. You didn't push me out of this family. You removed yourselves from my future before you ever got to see what I became. No one spoke. No one moved. I want to be clear about something, I said. I could see it in their faces already, the confusion, the wariness, the quiet fear of whatever was coming next. Brett was watching me with his jaw tight. Aunt Carol had pressed both palms flat on the table. My mother's eyes had finally come up to meet mine. I'm not here for revenge. The confusion deepened. They had been bracing themselves for a threat or an ultimatum, something explosive. The whole room had been sitting in anticipation of a blow they could not avoid. I'm here for closure, I said. Aunt Carol blinked. I needed to come back one time. I needed to say the truth out loud in this room, in front of everyone who had accepted the other version for so long. I needed you all to know that I know everything, not to punish you, but so I could finally set it all down. I looked around the table one last time. Closure is worth more to me than anything I could possibly take from any of you. I meant every single word. And somehow that was far harder for them to sit with than any act of revenge would have been. They had prepared to defend themselves against a fight. I had taken the fight away entirely. The apologies came in pieces, and not one of them was graceful. Aunt Carol cleared her throat like she had something dignified prepared. What came out instead was a stumbling mess of half-finished sentences. I never intended things to. I want you to understand that it was never supposed to be like this. Brett tried to call it a misunderstanding. He said families were complicated. He said he hoped we could all move forward together. His voice had none of the ease it carried at the start of the evening. He sounded like someone trying to talk his way past a door that was already firmly shut. My mother's apology was the quietest of all. She whispered my name from the far end of the table. Just Sonia. Nothing attached to it. No explanation, no reason, no account of any of it. I looked at her for a long moment. I had loved this woman my whole life, through everything she had allowed to happen. But love and forgiveness were two completely different things. Forgiveness required honesty. It required far more than a single whispered name across a dinner table. It was too late. Way too late. One more thing you should know, I said. I reached into the folder a final time and removed a single sheet of paper. I held it up so the room could see it. 2 months ago, I filed a formal complaint with the Estate Attorney's Oversight Board. I submitted copies of every document you've seen tonight, along with a full written account of how the inheritance transfer was authorized without my knowledge or consent. The attorney who approved that paperwork is currently under official review. Aunt Carol's face drained of all remaining color. Moving funds from a person's estate without their knowledge is not just a family disagreement, I said. It is fraud. I already knew that without anyone needing to tell me. Uncle Ray shifted back in his chair. Brett had gone completely still. I didn't come here tonight to threaten anyone, I continued. I came because I wanted to say everything directly face to face, before the legal process moved forward entirely on its own. I folded the folder closed and set it on the table beside me. The room had stopped breathing completely. I picked up my bag from the floor beside my chair. I didn't look for a final reaction. I didn't wait to see who would speak first. I had said everything I came to say clearly and fully on my own terms. I walked to the far end of the table and paused for a moment at my mother's chair. She was looking up at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not the tight, careful blankness she wore when something was difficult. This was real grief. Raw and unguarded and far too late. I held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then I looked away and kept walking. I passed Brett without acknowledging him. I passed Aunt Carol's side of the table without slowing. I walked down the long hallway, past the family photographs hanging in their frames, past every memory this house had ever held for me. The front door opened. Then it closed quietly behind me. No yelling. No scene. No final words. Just the soft sound of my shoes on the porch steps and the cool open air of the night. The same room that had been laughing just an hour ago couldn't find a single word to say. I stood outside in the cool night air, my bag on my shoulder and the folder tucked under my arm. The house was lit and warm-looking from the outside. Music still played faintly through the walls somewhere inside. But the laughter had stopped. I walked slowly to my car and stood beside it for a moment, looking up at a dark and perfectly clear sky. I had dreaded this reunion for 6 weeks. I had practiced what I would say. I had lost sleep over it and questioned more than once whether coming back was worth it at all. But standing there in the quiet, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Real clean peace that didn't need anything attached to it. They had read my silence as weakness for a very long time. They saw my distance as failure. They believed that walking away meant I had given up on everything. They were wrong about all of it. I hadn't been giving up. I had been preparing. My turn was never about hurting anyone. It was about standing up, telling the truth, and walking out of a room that no longer had any power over me. That was enough. That was everything.